or in fact without being visited by them when I didn't even call upon them. But that doesn't mean that my morality comes from that, or that I need the permission of the church by law established in Canterbury to think moral thoughts.
My point is that
or immoral ones, if it comes to that.
The point you're missing is not the King James Bible, but the sonnets have narrative voices behind them. Some of them are said by a young man. Some of them seem to be said in a homosexual tone. Others are clearly heterosexual. So in literature, because someone wrote a sonnet, that doesn't mean it's their opinion.
To be a Roman Catholic is not to believe that religion is a good idea, right? Or that God is a good thing, or that the Bible contains some true stories. It is to believe those things too. But it is to hold the belief that if you're not a Roman Catholic, you're not going to be saved.
I think it is not true, and I think it is also, not only is it not true, it is actually not the Catholic position.
Stand up, that man.
And to go even further, look, I don't even think, I think you've got to be careful here, because
I was trying to be.
I think we also need to be grateful to God, if you will, because of something that we have uniquely that makes us human. Something that in some strange sense almost appears to defy natural explanation. And by natural explanation, what I mean, of course, is not just the explanations of evolution or Darwin, but in a deeper sense, the explanation of being captive to physical laws. While all objects in the universe operate according to fixed laws, a stone, for example, has no choice but to roll down a hill. A cheetah has very little choice but to run after an antelope. We as human beings inhabit two rather distinct domains. On the one hand, this is the way we are. But then there's a second domain. This is the way we ought to be. In other words, we have this doubleness to our nature. And what's particular about the second domain, the domain of the ought, is that it appears to be free. In other words, you could never say to someone, you ought to do this, or you shouldn't do that, or you shouldn't discriminate on the basis of race, or you shouldn't be a gay basher, if they had no choice in the matter. If their decision was solely determined by physical laws, all of morality would be an illusion. But morality is as real of a fact in the world as any other. It's as real as this watch in front of me. If there are human beings who are without morality, we don't have philosophical disputations with them. We put them in straitjackets and carry them away. They're sociopaths. So the point I'm trying to make here is that not only is morality, if you will, a strange fact in the world, but it's a fact that militates against self-interest. And that is part of its peculiarity. Now, if you're an atheist, you might say, I'm grateful to Christianity, I'm grateful to the legacy of Christianity.
No.
What should I do about all this? And I think what you should do about all this is number one, to respect the fact that our world is the way it is, and your values are the way you are because of God, and specifically because of Christianity. And second, you might do well to consider living as if there is a God, because ultimately that will make you a better person. And if you give thanks to God, and if you talk to God, you never know. He might say something back. Thank you very much.
Shall I just do it? Yes, sir. Thank you, Dinesh. Am I audible to all? Make it more convincing. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Dinesh. Dinesh is quite right to have said to you that there's no element of prearrangement in any of our debates. We've never concerted or compared notes before starting. And I hope we never will. We've never given the same speeches twice. We've sometimes repeated each other and each other's arguments. But there must have been an energy leak somewhere this evening, because he wanted to praise me and my fellow atheists for our compassion. There must be some mistake here, at least in my case. One of the very few times I've ever felt like being a Christian is when reading how the early church fathers lost for an account of why it is fun to be in paradise. The alleviation of the first 100 million years of saying thank you, for example. Would say, well, at least you can go to the lip of the thing and look down and see the screams and wails and torments of the damned when you want to be cheered up. And I think, that's me. I'd be religious on that basis. One of my very few pleasures, actually, is crowing over the misfortunes of other people and trying to add to those misfortunes. And I'm hoping, in fact, to score a few points of that sort tonight. Thomas Aquinas, like me, didn't believe in astrology, or rather, he didn't think you should try it because it would only let the demons in. He thought it was a very dangerous science, the sort of thing that could allow the devils a foothold. Unlike me, believed himself capable of levitation. Had a higher opinion of himself, in fact, as a debater than I do of myself. But Dinesh has left me with no alternative but to start at a position I hadn't ever begun with before, which is to ask anyone here if they've read a novel called When It Was Dark by Guy Thorne. There's an off chance. I thought someone waved there. It was a huge bestseller before the First World War. Enormous international bestseller.
Dinesh claims morality is proof of God. That humans, unlike stones or cheetahs, live in a realm of ought that can't be explained by natural law. But history doesn't back him up. Moral codes existed thousands of years before Christianity. The Code of Hammurabi, 1750 BCE, established justice and protections for the weak. Egyptian texts like the Instruction of Ptahhotep stressed honesty and fairness. Confucius taught reciprocity centuries before the Gospels. The Stoics spoke of natural law grounded in reason, not revelation. Morality wasn't handed down from the sky. It was hammered out in human societies trying to survive. Biology confirms it. Hunter-gatherers enforced fairness because cooperation kept them alive. Franz de Waal's primate studies show chimpanzees and capuchins protesting unequal treatment. If monkeys grasp justice, morality isn't supernatural, it's natural selection at work. Meanwhile, early Christian thinkers praised cruelty. Tertullian and Aquinas both taught that part of heaven's joy would be watching the damned suffer. For centuries, the church defended slavery, silenced women, and resisted reform. Real progress came with the Enlightenment. Voltaire, Paine, Wollstonecraft, who challenged religious authority in the name of universal rights. So no, morality doesn't come from Christianity. It comes from us.
But the reason that you've got to say he might have been made up is you're establishing essentially an impossible canon of historical verification. Most of the historical figures in the ancient world are attested to by one or two, or in Christ has probably more attestations than many other figures whose historicity you wouldn't doubt for a moment.
Dinesh, I don't know why you're doing this to yourself.
I'm doing it to you,
the existence of
actually.
the Macedonian royal house is an archaeological question as well as among many others. It's decidable in innumerable ways. The probability of there having been someone with the one name of Socrates is very high, but it can't be absolutely attested to, and it doesn't need to be, because those ideas would have been in someone else's mouth if they weren't in his. The idea, it surely is important to you that the physical existence of Jesus can be proved in a rather different way, since he is the Son of God, and the Word made flesh and born of a virgin, and by his death we are all healed. So you've got a little bit more riding on this than I do, and you've got no evidence for it. None.
We're not.
There is no evidence for any of this proposition.
I may have a lot riding on the resurrection, and we're not talking about those things. we're really saying, what you seem to be
I'm sorry,
saying,
but I am insisting on talking
what
about
you
it.
seem to be saying, even though we have we have the Gospels, we have the Acts of the Apostles, we have the testimonies of Suetonius, Tacitus, Roman sources, Greek sources, Jewish sources, including Josephus, then we have an early Christian movement following Christ that has no incentive to do so. They're in a persecuting Roman Empire. Many of them go to their deaths because of Christ, and you're saying they all went to it because of a made-up guy. That's historically preposterous.
No,
and most historians agree with me.
The willingness of people to die for a rumor or a delusion or an illusion is very well attested. There's no element. There's never been, alas for our poorly evolved mammalian primate species, there's never been a period of history, however modern, where that won't happen. Look at how many people are still willing to do this for Joseph Smith, for example. Or for a deluded epileptic called Muhammad, a plagiarist of some of the foregoing. I repeat, if you will accept this for one, will you not accept it for all? Or are you not obliged to accept it for all? Are not all these prophets and revelations equally valid or equally false? My position is at least intelligible.
Let's come to your question about...
Consistent.
May I ask you about the question about religion poisoning everything? And I want to read a list of a few names. Dante. Did religion poison Dante? Did religion poison Shakespeare? Did religion poison Milton? Did religion poison Bach? Did religion poison Handel? Did religion poison Michelangelo? What about Bernini? What about the guys who did the Gothic cathedrals? Yes or no?
Yes to Dante. Made him waste a lot of his talent on descriptions of hell. Very gloating, very poorly written, sadistic accounts of what happened to people who he didn't agree with. That was a real waste of his
talent. What about Shakespeare? Was he in the same league? Ruined by religion?
No, with Shakespeare, well, I'm forced to the belief that if he wasn't himself a secret Catholic, he was probably from a closet Catholic family, and that there's some intriguing evidence in his work of the practice of the ancient Mass and so forth, and that's worth knowing, but it neither adds nor subtracts anything to his talent, and that when someone writes, when in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate, wishing me like to one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed. You want to ask two things. One, who is this person of whom Shakespeare is jealous? Who is this man he wishes he was? Who is the man who has so many more talents, more friends than him? And second, he got it right about deaf heaven and troubling it with his bootless cries. He knew what despair was. He knows that the realization that you must begin with is that the heavens are empty and that we have to deal with each other here on earth, and this is the only life we have. Otherwise, we wouldn't need Shakespeare.
Christopher, this is why...
We can have the holy books. Do you want to go on through all the architects and poets? I'm willing to do it.
No, but this is why you are such a charming evader. Because my point is that Shakespeare's moral universe is inconceivable without Christianity. The strength of it is he gives voice to different views within that universe. You isolate a view from one character, impute it to Shakespeare, and imply that Shakespeare somehow transcends...
Excuse me, the person I was just quoting was Shakespeare. That's one of his sonnets. It's not a character from a play, as you should know.
The sonnets are
all... It's him reflecting upon his own condition. Now, my life, I'm willing to admit, my own life, which is mainly devoted to the question of language, is inconceivable without, say, the King James version of the Bible, sometimes not by the Aquinas group, but by others called the Authorized version of the Bible. And by the Cranmer Prayer Book, which falls somewhere on the Protestant Catholic frontier, and other things. I couldn't imagine my life without being able to call upon verses and staves of this, or in fact without being visited by them when I didn't even call upon them. But that doesn't mean that my morality comes from that, or that I need the permission of the church by law established in Canterbury to think moral thoughts.
My point is that
or immoral ones, if it comes to that.
The point you're missing is not the King James Bible, but the sonnets have narrative voices behind them. Some of them are said by a young man. Some of them seem to be said in a homosexual tone. Others are clearly heterosexual. So in literature, because someone wrote a sonnet, that doesn't mean it's their opinion. But it's your turn to ask me a question.
Well, you know that, I suppose one of the things that most upsets and depresses and alarms, nauseates secular humanists is the sectarianism or any appeal to it. In other words, I didn't want Rick Warren at the inauguration, not just because of his apparent not just because he's a boring fat dunce and so on, but because and not because he's not inclusive enough about gay people, because he doesn't have to be inclusive about that if he doesn't, but because he was openly willing to say to a Jewish woman who asked him in public, could she too go to heaven or come to heaven? No, you can't. Now, I don't see how he can't say that. I'm throat clearing Dinesh in this way because I want to ask you something, and it's another question I want to lodge in the minds of others present here this evening. To be a Roman Catholic is not to believe that religion is a good idea, all right, or that God is a good thing, or that the Bible contains some true stories. It is to believe those things too, but it is to hold the belief that if you're not a Roman Catholic, you're not going to be saved. Now, so I'm asking you, and we now have a fresh occupant of the Holy See, Mr. Ratzinger, as he'll always be to me, who is increasingly determined to restore the doctrine of ex ecclesia nulla salus, that there is not just the church, but there's one church, one true church. Well, I'm going to ask you anyway, and you must have asked yourself, and I'm going to ask everyone else present for their consideration. Do you think that's true or not?
I think it is not true, and I think it is also, not only is it not true, it is actually not the Catholic position,
Stand up, that man.
And to go even further, look, I don't even think, I think you've got to be careful here because
I was trying to be.
Even from an evangelical point of view, you mentioned Rick Warren, and even if someone takes the Bible for what it says, literally, I'm not a biblical literalist, but even if you were, the Bible says really very clearly that Jesus is the way, in fact the only way, to salvation. But there's a second proposition that is often confused with that, and that is everyone in the world, whether they lived before Jesus or whether they lived in other cultures, but if they have not positively accepted Jesus Christ, they are going to hell. There are two groups of people who infer this. One is a certain type of extreme and ignorant fundamentalist, and the second is a certain type of equally ignorant atheist. Both read the Bible the same way and draw from it conclusions that are actually neither stated in Scripture nor in fact the position of either the Catholic or the Protestant churches.
Dinesh ends by insisting that morality proves God, that our sense of justice and equality comes directly from Christianity. Christopher Hitchens answers by pointing to the record. The Bible contains explicit instructions that uphold slavery. Exodus 21 sets down laws for buying, beating, and inheriting slaves. Leviticus 25 authorizes the ownership of foreigners as property for life. The New Testament repeats the same instruction. Slaves, obey your masters. These words were not symbolic. They became the backbone of centuries of Christian defense of slavery. In 1452, Pope Nicholas V issued Dum Diversas, giving Portugal the right to enslave non-Christians. The Anglican Church owned plantations in the Caribbean. In the American South, ministers filled their sermons with these very verses to defend the Confederacy. Entire congregations sang hymns on Sunday and returned on Monday to work their human property, all with biblical sanction. Women's place in Christian teaching followed the same line. 1 Timothy 2:12 commands women to be silent and not to teach men. Augustine described women as the weaker sex. Aquinas wrote that women were defective men. Canon law bound wives to their husbands as legal dependents well into the modern era. The Vatican resisted women's suffrage into the 20th century. Marital rape was not recognized as a crime in most Christian countries until secular courts struck down the doctrine that wives owed permanent sexual access to their husbands. Generations of women were told their duty was obedience, their silence a virtue, their suffering a divine command. The history of moral progress unfolds in other places. During the Enlightenment, new ideas of freedom, equality, and rights emerged through the work of writers and revolutionaries. Voltaire denounced the cruelty of religious persecution with biting satire. Thomas Paine wrote The Rights of Man in 1791, declaring that every person possessed inherent political rights. Mary Wollstonecraft published A Vindication of the Rights of Woman in 1792, demanding education and independence. Denis Diderot wrote that men will never be free until the last king is strangled with the entrails of the last priest. These voices did not whisper, they shouted, and their words shaped the revolutions that followed in France, America, and beyond. When laws against slavery appeared, they were written by governments moved by abolitionists, influenced by reason and humanism. When women gained the right to vote, it was after centuries of resistance by religious institutions. Consent laws came through the tireless work of secular reformers. Abolitionists, suffragists, and labor activists carried torches that lit entire nations, and those flames were often fought hardest by pulpits and altars. Hitchens closes with his trademark clarity. Morality is not a divine gift wrapped and delivered from above. It is a creation of human hands, earned through argument, sacrifice, and courage. Every gain in liberty and dignity was the result of people daring to think for themselves and refusing to be told that ancient texts must rule forever. That struggle is ongoing, and it belongs to all of us.
Well, I do think that religion provides a survival advantage, but it in no way follows that religion is untrue. I think that reason provides a survival advantage. We developed large brains, for example, to elude woolly mammoths and so on, or at least the challenges of nature. And yet that doesn't mean reason is untrustworthy as a means of doing logic or trying to understand planetary rotations and so on. So religion could be both a source of solidarity, which it clearly is. Look, the vast majority of people from the beginning of history in all cultures have been religious. So from a Darwinian point of view, you have to concede that religion has a powerful survival advantage. Now earlier, a young lady asked a question that was treated as silly when she was talking about lying and stealing, but I think the deeper import of that question is this. Religion is ultimately a reason for hope in the idea of cosmic justice. And what I mean by that is that life is very unfair. We believe in justice and we say what goes around comes around and stuff like that, but we know it's not true, right? Many times the bad guy ends up on top, and many times the good guy comes to grief. So, all the religions of the world are in some senses asserting that that may be the terrestrial word on things, but it's not the final word. I mean, look at Hinduism. If you are a lousy guy in this life, hey, we're going to be seeing you as a cockroach in the next life. Cosmic justice. So, the survival advantage of religion is multiple. I mean, number one, it is the sole tested means of transmitting morality to the young. Right? In every culture, if you ask someone, where did you learn about right and wrong? He says, I'm a Muslim, I'm a Hindu. Now, true, we can probably do it by philosophy, but I've yet to meet a guy who says, I got my morality from Hegel. So we can talk all we want about philosophy, but the truth of it is religion has delivered the goods as being the transmission belt of conveying morality. What about hope in life and a sense of purpose? When there was the Virginia Tech massacre, how come that secular campus suddenly became a kind of cathedral in which everyone was invoking consolation and God? In other words, my point is religion, by giving a sense of purpose and meaning to life, by ultimately answering the large questions that science has proved radically incapable of even entertaining. I mean, science doesn't even ask why there is a universe, and only purports to describe how we got a universe. So science is answering, in this case, a very different question than the one posed by religion. So if you imagine two tribes, a secular tribe that basically says we're descended from the amoebas, we've come from nowhere, we're going nowhere, morality is stuff we make up as we go along, and another group of people who believe we're the special creation of God, history has a purpose, your life has a purpose, that even if no one else loves you, there's a God who loves you, and that there is an eternal life to reward the just. Which of those two camps is more likely to survive and prosper?
Dinesh is doing very well for the first half of that, and I completely agree with him. My friend and ally, Daniel Dennett, in his book on belief in belief, says that he thinks it's extremely likely that religious faith gave people advantages of survival. And if you go to the witch doctor and you think he is a real doctor, everyone knows that there's an element of morale involved in recovery, and it may be a very small advantage based on an illusion, but these are areas where even a tiny advantage may indeed help. However, rather than confine himself to that, Dinesh goes on to say, but wouldn't it be nice if it was true what the witch doctor said? You just heard him say it. I mean, after all, you'd feel a huge amount better if there was life everlasting as a reward for virtue. Well, that's known as wish thinking. I phrase it like this. I'll take up your Jefferson challenge again, if you like. Thomas Jefferson says in Notes on the State of Virginia about the slavery question, he says, I tremble for my country when I reflect, you've all read it, that God is just. If you haven't read it, you'll remember I said it. You'll go and read it now. I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just. Who can forget? But if there is a just God, what is there to tremble about? If there's a God who really loves you and knows that you're there and cares for you and looks out for you and is interested in how you're getting on and how you're going to get on and wants the best for you, what is a small question like slavery? All your feelings of responsibility and care about that are dissolved. You're bathed in the refulgence of an absolutely wonderful thing.
Well,
the only price of it would be, unfortunately, because nothing comes without a price, you'd have to submit to a celestial dictatorship. But hey, what's that in return for a ton of love?
Well, I'll answer your question very briefly. Why was Jefferson trembling? Well, Jefferson was a slave owner. He owned about 200 slaves. And he never freed any of them before his death. He understood, he didn't have to be told, the tremendous innate power of human selfishness. You don't need theology to explain the slave owner. Slavery is rooted in human selfishness. Jefferson knew that and how powerful that was. He trembled that that instinct, so rooted and so powerful, would prevail over what Lincoln would later call the better angels of our nature. So he trembled because man, although he knows better, is inclined to pick ultimately, in the short term, the more profitable, the more convenient choice, but ultimately the terrible choice.
Gentlemen, we only have about 10 minutes before Father Kevin comes back up and declares the winner. So why don't we try to get as many students as we can.
Okay,
Sir,
very quick. Jefferson did free the ones who he'd fathered, and he did free their mother. He freed the ones who looked like him.
In the mezzanine?
I'm going to ask this question and run because I'm from CSU. This is for Hitchens. You said it is not unusual for people to die for a myth in reference to the Muslims and the Christians. However, don't historians generally agree that all the 12 disciples were martyred and killed, or 11 of them? And wouldn't it be much more strange for first-generation Christians to be tortured when they know it's a lie?
Doesn't challenge what I said at all. I take it as a comment. No, there's no historian who would say that, by the way. No. It's not, these things are not historically established.
And no one ever died for anything they knew to be a lie, even if you think of the Islamic radicals. They are dying for an
didn't say they
imagined
knew it.
promise.
I didn't say they knew it to be a lie. I said the whole story is a legend.
But if the whole story is a legend, then the early Christians, having no basis for it,
May have
would
been under another impression. I can't know the subjective views of somebody else. I don't. It's the same as someone saying they saw the stigmata. If I wasn't there, I can't say to them, they didn't. I can only say, I think it's much more likely they were under misapprehension.
Exactly. Well, we're talking about plausibility of motive here. And,
Yes.
you know, for example, Paul, in discussing the issue of Christ's death, says that he has 500 witnesses. He says some of them are dead, but some of them are alive. And this is, by the way, in a book written about 30 years after the crucifixion. So my point is, we're talking about historical documents in historical time, and we're trying to attach motives and plausibility to them. I also want to point out, you mentioned a moment ago, wishful thinking. Somebody asked me about the survival advantage, and so I answered in those terms. But I do want to point out that wishful thinking is always punished in evolutionary terms. From an evolutionary point of view, it makes absolutely no sense to entertain a set of beliefs about the afterlife that are in fact illusionary. To see this, imagine two rabbits, one of which is, you might say, the religious rabbit, and the other is the atheist rabbit. And they are both being pursued by a lion. The atheist rabbit goes, I have only one life to live, I better run like hell. The religious rabbit goes, I got another life waiting for me that's even better. Which rabbit is more likely to survive? Point I'm trying to make is, from an evolutionary point of view, religion is very expensive. People who much poorer than we are built pyramids and cathedrals. They invested a lot of money in this. My point is, why would these things survive if they were illusions? Why wouldn't evolution encourage atheist points of view to survive? Because they are based on a more hard-headed assessment of the world in front of us.
That's a good question. Answering it in reverse, and assuming the question is to me, and trying not to take up too much time, the huge majority of people in the educated, developed world have become at least secular. You can certainly plot it along a graph of development, that church attendance, religious fundamentalism, all these kinds of things have declined as we've evolved in that sense, if you want to put it that crudely. The second, though, is that I don't think that there are certain lessons that are not transmissible.
Christopher Hitchens opens with his usual sharpness. He points out that belief's persistence has never been proof of truth. People once thought plagues came from demons, or that thunder was Zeus hurling bolts. Those myths lasted for centuries, but survival doesn't make them real. Comfort, he says, has never been evidence. He turns to history. Entire empires were built on slavery and conquest while invoking divine blessing. The Spanish Inquisition tortured thousands in the name of faith. Papal decrees authorized Europeans to enslave Africans. In the American South, preachers quoted the Bible to defend bondage. Crusades marched with crosses while burning villages. If there is a universal judge, Hitchens says, that judge has remained silent through centuries of injustice. Bart Ehrman adds depth from the texts themselves. Exodus and Leviticus regulate slavery, not abolish it. Paul commands slaves to obey their masters. The same writings order women to remain silent, submissive, and dependent. Church fathers built entire systems on these verses. Augustine declared women naturally weaker. Aquinas called them misbegotten men, and Jerome described the female body as unclean. These weren't just sermons. They shaped laws, property rights, and the rules of marriage for centuries. Hitchens returns to meaning. Religion offers stories, he says, but stories are not answers. Afterlife, divine purpose, cosmic judgment, none have evidence behind them. What matters are the choices we make here and now, building justice, resisting oppression, defending freedom, and creating meaning without asking permission from authority. The debate continues, but the message is clear. Human progress has been carved out by those willing to challenge sacred claims and hold power to account. That struggle, Hitchens insists, is not finished. It's our responsibility to carry it forward with courage. What's your perspective on this? Do you think morality depends on religion, or can ethics and compassion stand on their own? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If this sparked new ideas, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to keep the discussion alive.
You could, by an argument from design, prove answered prayers, or prove that someone born of a virgin was therefore the son of a god, or could prove that resurrections occur, and that by people being tortured to death thousands of years ago, we are now redeemed, that we are vicariously forgiven our own offenses by human sacrifice. How does deism help you to that? It doesn't. Everyone in this room is an atheist. Everyone can name a God in which they do not believe. Let them advance the case that the one in which they believe is the superior one. Is it nonetheless possible for an atheist to say, a proclaimed atheist to say, as I do, proclaim myself to be, that God positively can be said not to exist? No. It's a very common misunderstanding about my fraternity, sorority. I'll just take a moment to clear it up. The atheist says, no persuasive argument for the existence of God has ever been advanced or adduced without convincing rebuttal. That no argument in favor stands or has been found to stand the test of argument and evidence. We cannot say that we know that there could be no such entity. Among other things, we are too reverent of the extraordinary time of discovery, innovation, pushing back of the frontiers of knowledge and understanding that's taken place just in our own time to make any such remark. But by saying this, we say, I think, quite a lot. There is no valid or coherent or consistent argument that would not work, if it comes to that, for the existence of any God. Now, I notice it was by a slight work of illusion, a bit of tap dancing there, that Dr. Turek went from being a deist to a theist, and then from being a theist to a Christian. Now, I know he does not believe in the existence of the sun god Ra. I'm practically certain he doesn't believe in the existence of Zeus. If you'll pick up a copy of my Portable Atheist, a selection of the finest writings by non-believers down the years, and just turn to the 3 pages where Mencken, H.L. Mencken, lists the easiest to name 3,000 gods that used to be worshipped and that no longer are held to exist by anybody, you'll spare me the trouble of reading them out. No, he thinks he doesn't just know, Dr. Turek, that there is a God, he knows which one is the right one. From a potentially infinite list, actually from a list that's as long as the number of people there are or have ever been in the human species, because if you ever argue with a theist or a deist, as I do every day, you'll find they all believe in a God of their very own. Indeed, they often say a personal God. Indeed, they often say a personal savior. So out of what are we reifying a concept that applies to all of us? Out of nothing but wish thinking and nonsense and fear and ignorance, and above all, and I'm not quitting on this point, servility. Everyone in this room is an atheist. Everyone can name a God in which they do not believe. Let them advance the case that the one in which they believe is the superior one.
Hitchens is pointing out something that holds up historically and philosophically. Over centuries, people have proposed arguments for a God: the cosmological argument, design argument, moral argument, but none of them have held under critical examination. For example, David Hume challenged the design argument back in the 1700s, saying complexity in nature doesn't automatically mean a designer. Today, the multiverse theory offers a scientific explanation for fine-tuning without needing a supernatural cause. He also brings up the thousands of gods humans have worshipped. That's backed by history. There are over 3,000 documented deities from cultures all over the world. Believers today reject almost all of them. So when someone says their God is the true one, they're making the same move atheists make, just with one exception. That's not reasoned evidence. It's cultural inheritance or personal conviction. And to just make it simple, everyone can be an atheist because we already don't believe in most gods. We all have something we believe in, but belief alone isn't the same as truth.
Now, the same tap dancing hopes you will not notice that deism and theism are two quite different things. The deist argument says that there is so much order apparent in nature and in the cosmos and in the universe that it might be unwise to assume that such order has no one interested in ordering or designing it. That assumption might be an unsafe one. The philosopher Paley, in his Natural Theology, said design implies a designer. He came up with the very famous image of the watch. If you come across a watch, if you're a primitive tribes person in the Sahara, you may not know what it's for, but you know that it's not a rock or a vegetable. You know it has a purpose, and someone made it that way. Until quite recently, that was the default position of most intelligent people, including Mr. Jefferson, who, despite his intermittent atheism, in my judgment, was a theist. Was a deist. He would debate with, among the many skills he had, was a very advanced level of paleontology. He would debate with the greatest paleontologist of his time, the Count de Buffon. How comes it? How can it be that we find seashells so high on the mountains of Virginia? How can this be? Not even the most intelligent people of that day, and it's very recent, it's an instant in historical time, had any idea how that could be. There isn't anyone in this room who wasn't educated and brought up knowing exactly how that is. It's just a shame that Jefferson and many other intelligent and humane and well-educated literate people just couldn't see that far. He wasn't to know, though Darwin was born in his day, on the same day, actually in 1809 as Abraham Lincoln, the very same day, the two great emancipators, Darwin being, in my judgment, the greater of the two. Now we know this proposition to be true, the proposition that was ridiculed so pathetically, I have to say, I thought, by Dr. Torrey. There is no explanation for the origins of our species, for the origins of our cosmos, for the origins of our globe itself. There is not one explanation left which requires the existence of a deus ex machina. In every case, we have a better or sufficient explanation. I think that assertion of mine will stand any challenge this evening. I'm looking forward to hearing some more of them. Of course, Darwin used creationist images. He actually set out to vindicate Paley's theology. Thought he could do it by his taxonomical study of nature. Einstein used God images when he spoke of the extraordinary majesty of the cosmos. It's in us. It's in our vocabulary. It's hardwired in us, you might almost say, to use images of awe-inspiring, godly, Mozartian, you might say, or even Shakespearean images when talking about these things. But when we come down to the actual analysis of them, we find that we don't need the prime mover at all, and that most of the prime mover explanations, if not all of them, have been positively misleading. So that the deist may propose a designer, and I may not be able to show you convincingly that there could be no such person. But the theist has all their work still ahead of them. From this designer, how do we get to the designer who answers prayers? Did you hear a thing? I mean, just a phrase, even an implication, even a suggestion from anything my opponent said, that you could, by an argument from design, prove answered prayers? Or prove that someone born of a virgin was therefore the son of a god? Or could prove that resurrections occur, and that by people being tortured to death thousands of years ago, we are now redeemed, that we are vicariously forgiven our own offenses by human sacrifice? How does deism help you to that? It doesn't. It quite simply doesn't and cannot. And the attempt to build from one to the other is a conjuring trick of a very vulgar, I think, kind.
Hitchens is right to call out the jump from deism to theism. Deism only says there might be a creator behind the universe's order. Theism adds layers: answered prayers, miracles, virgin births, resurrections. That leap has never been backed by evidence. The design argument he critiques, Paley's watchmaker analogy, was seriously challenged by Darwin's theory of natural selection, which explains biological complexity without needing a designer. Today, we have overwhelming support from genetics, fossil records, and observed evolution in labs. The watchmaker argument doesn't hold when we understand how nature builds complexity over time. Hitchens also mentioned Jefferson's confusion about seashells in the mountains. Now we know that's due to plate tectonics, and marine sediment uplift, fully explained by modern geology. What used to be a mystery no longer needs supernatural answers. And about Einstein, he spoke of God as a metaphor. He said, "I do not believe in a personal God, and I have never denied this." His views were closer to Spinoza's pantheism, not traditional theism. In short, every gap once used to justify God, from life's origin to Earth's features, now has natural explanations. And no part of deism leads to claims like human sacrifice for redemption. There's no evidence connecting the two. Let's hear Frank Turek's rebuttal.
I want to point out that most of what Christopher just said there is pretty much complaints about religion and religious people and has no impact on whether or not God exists. Religious people can be the worst people that ever lived. That says nothing about whether or not God exists. People can do evil. That doesn't mean the parents don't exist. Children can do evil. Doesn't mean the parents don't exist. My kids do evil, but I'm still here. I do evil. My dad's still here. In fact, he's sitting right there. What does that prove about whether or not God exists? Let me try and go down some of the things Christopher said. Yes, I am an atheist when it comes to Zeus. But Zeus is not spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, moral, personal, intelligent creator that I hopefully, at least I thought I gave evidence for. And maybe Christopher will come back to my statements on that later. I don't believe in Zeus because I don't think there's any evidence for Zeus, but I think there's evidence for the theistic God. Deism, I didn't make the direct shift to theism. I probably should have been more explicit. I think it's obvious there's a theistic God because life came several billion years after the creation. That is not a deistic concept, that is a theistic concept. I didn't say anything about Christianity. Even though I am a Christian, I don't have time to defend Christianity here. I'd love to debate Christopher on the issue of Christianity in the future, and I'll publicly offer that right now. If he wants to debate whether or not the New Testament documents are reliable and tell us really what happened about what Jesus came and said and did, I'd be happy to do it. But when I mentioned before, I have a couple arguments on the bench. I've got almost a full baseball team of arguments here. I've got a couple arguments on the bench. It's the resurrection is one of them, and I don't have time to get to that here. So I'm not backing up the Christian God here. I'm backing up a theistic God, even though personally I do believe in a Christian God. He claimed Darwin was the great emancipator, and that he went on to talk about atrocities, and I think he again missed my point. As I said before, I'm not saying atheists can't be moral. Christopher, what he says in his book again, much of it is true. Religious people have done awful things. In fact, Christianity predicts we'll be hypocrites. That's what the church is. It's full of hypocrites. Whenever somebody says, I don't want to go to church, there's too many hypocrites down there, I always say, come on down, pal, we got room for one more. That's what the church is. We're all fallen, we're all sinners, that's why we need a Savior, because we can't do it. And Christopher said, well, how can you command somebody to be well when they have no capacity to be well? Well, we were well in the beginning, and I'm going into Christian theology here, I understand. I'll just try and answer the point. We were well in the beginning, but then we messed up, and so God, the great physician, came back to save us. That's Christian theology. As again, I don't have time to support it. I'm just pointing out that is the theology. Now, Christopher talked about atrocities, but again, on the atheistic worldview, here's the main point. How do you define what an atrocity is? Who defines it? Who has the authority to define what an atrocity is? The carbon atom? The benzene molecule?
Turek claims Hitchens is just complaining about religion. That's not true. Hitchens is pointing out that religious claims like prayer, miracles, virgin births have no evidence. That's a valid challenge, not a complaint. Turek says his God is different from Zeus because it's spaceless and timeless. Those are just descriptions. There's no testable evidence for any of that. You can describe a unicorn as invisible and eternal. It doesn't make it real. He argues life began billions of years after the Big Bang, and that proves a theistic God. That's just a timeline. Astrophysics explains it naturally. No God needed. Turek brings up morality and says atheists can't justify it. That's false. Morality is rooted in evolution and social behavior. We see it in animals, cooperation, empathy, fairness. These traits evolved because they help groups survive. He asks where reason, math, and consciousness come from. Neuroscience studies consciousness. Math is a tool we invented to describe the world. These aren't mysteries that require a God. Turek quotes scientists like Crick, but Crick never said God was the answer. He said the origin of life is complex and still being studied. That's not proof of design. It's honest science. And DNA, it's chemical, not coded by a mind. Self-replicating molecules can emerge through natural processes. There's no evidence that intelligence is required. Everything Turek mentioned either has a natural explanation or is still being explored. None of it proves a theistic God.
I'm not saying you have to believe in God to be moral. I'm not saying that only religious people are moral. I'm not saying atheists can't be moral. I'm not saying atheists don't know morality. I'm saying there's no way to justify what is right and what is wrong unless there's some authority that provides it. What is the authority? In a materialistic worldview, there is no authority. The carbon atom has no moral authority over you. And it seems that Christopher goes on and on about how he does not want to be under some kind of divine totalitarianism. That is a moral rejection of God. Where does he come up with this immoral totalitarianism? His worldview does not afford immorality, because his worldview does not afford morality. He has to borrow from the Christian worldview in order to argue against it. In fact, he has to sit in God's lap to slap his face. Where does he get morality from? Where does he get reason from? Where does he get mathematics from? Where does he get consciousness from? Where does the universe... He said there are explanations for where the universe came from. Atheistic, I'd love to hear them. I haven't heard one yet. How does something come from nothing with extreme fine-tuning? What is the explanation for that? He said there are arguments for the beginning of life that are naturalistic, not according to the people who are studying the matter. How about Francis Crick? If I can find his quote here. Francis Crick said, "Every time I write a paper on the origin of life, I swear I'll never write another one because there's too much speculation running after too few facts." Mark Kirshner of Harvard and John C. Gerhardt of Berkeley said, "Everything about evolution before the bacteria-like life forms is sheer conjecture." Biochemist Klaus Doss admits that after more than 30 years of research into the origin of life has led to, quote, "a better perception of the immensity of the problem of the origin of life on Earth rather than its solution. At present, all discussions on the principal theories and experiments in the field either end in stalemate or in a confession of ignorance." Now, I'm not saying that this is a default position, that it must be God. I'm not saying that I just lack a natural explanation for the origin of life. I'm saying that specified complexity, information, the DNA structure that we all have is evidence for an intelligent being. Because information only comes from minds. The laws of ink and paper did not create, God is not great. There was a mind behind it that brought it into existence. And there's a mind behind DNA. What is the atheistic explanation for DNA? What is the atheistic explanation for information? What is the atheistic explanation for all of these 9 things I mentioned? How much time do I have? I have none. Survey said, sit down. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Well, I think I'll just invite Dr. Turek to do the following. Make available to us on a sheet of paper, which I'm sure he has, the thesaurus of quotations that he's found from this and that scientists and physicists and natural scientists and so forth. And you will find, when you read them, when you look at them, I was writing them down as you went through them, all of these are statements of uncertainty. All of them. They're statements of all we know is how little we know. That's been for many years my definition of an educated person. Someone who knows enough to know how ignorant they are. It actually is it's not my own original definition, it comes from the Greek, but it's the only definition that works. And no one working, toiling in the field of science could possibly say anything less or more of themselves, especially at a time like this. But there you have it right away. The theistic and the deistic explanation has to be based on a certainty that there is a supervising and, if you want to be a theist, a caring and intervening creator who manages these matters, and there hasn't been a single sentence.
So who made the stronger case?
I mean, you wrote a book called How Jesus Became God. And of course, one of the key claims of the Gospels is Jesus claiming divinity, claiming to be God, and that takes different manifestations in different Gospels. But what's your view? Is your view that anything that looks like Jesus claiming some kind of divine status is more likely an amendment of the Jesus story than an original part?
So I wouldn't put it quite that simply. I mean, there are people today who claim to be God, and so I don't say they didn't say that because somebody wouldn't say that. People do say that, and so the issue is always how do you know what Jesus said? When it comes to the New Testament Gospels, we of course have the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And as I was saying earlier, it looks like Matthew and Luke have both used Mark. Mark is probably our earliest account. Matthew and Luke are later. Matthew and Luke appear to have used some other source that we don't have anymore for a number of their sayings of Jesus. And scholars have called the source Q, and it doesn't matter to my argument whether you think Q existed or not. But Luke does say he had earlier sources, so it's not implausible that he had a source that had some of Jesus' sayings. And so what scholars do when trying to figure out what Jesus really said, once they acknowledge that maybe he didn't say everything, because we know Jesus didn't say everything that's attributed to him in the early church, because we have other Gospels that everybody agrees Jesus didn't say these things. Okay. So somebody's making up stories, and the question is, and people are changing stories, and so we have absolute evidence that there's no question about it. So the question is whether that happens in the four Gospels or not, or whether somehow they were protected from ever recording anything that Jesus actually didn't ever say. Were they protected from that? And what is striking to most scholars is that when you lay out the sources chronologically, over time, Jesus starts changing the sorts of things that he says.
A lot of people assume Jesus always claimed to be God, but Bart Ehrman is showing us why that's not so simple. He explains that our earliest gospel, Mark, doesn't present Jesus as clearly divine the way John does, which came much later. Over time, the way Jesus talks in the Gospels shifts. In earlier accounts, Jesus is more like a prophet or a teacher. But in later ones, he starts saying things that sound more divine. That's important, because it shows how stories about Jesus evolved. Scholars agree that the Gospels were written decades after Jesus died, by people who weren't eyewitnesses. They also had different sources. Some we don't even have anymore. And it's a fact that people in the early church were adding, changing, or even making up stories. We see that in other Gospels that didn't make it into the Bible. So if the stories changed over time, how can we be sure Jesus actually said he was God? That's the real question. Let's hear more from Bart to see how this all unfolded. He's about to share specific examples.
And so, for example, in Mark and in Q, which would be the sayings in Matthew and Luke not found in Mark, those would probably be our earliest sources. Jesus principally talks about the kingdom of God that's coming. There's a kingdom of God that's coming. You need to repent and prepare for it, because if you don't, you're going to be destroyed. If you are on the side of God, you'll enter into this kingdom and there'll be a glorious existence. And so Jesus is preaching about the coming kingdom of God in Mark and Q. When you get to the Gospel of John, Jesus no longer preaches about the kingdom of God. He doesn't tell people to repent in preparation for the coming of the kingdom of God. He doesn't say that you will be destroyed when the kingdom of God comes. The way he talks is different now. And rather than talking principally about God and the coming kingdom, he talks about himself, who he is. And so you get some of the most famous sayings of Jesus. Especially
I am the way, the truth, and the life.
The way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. I am the light of the world. I am the bread of life.
The good shepherd.
Before Abraham was, I am. I and the Father are one. You get all of these claims, many of which have a component of divine identity connected with him. He's claiming to be a divine being. That's crystal clear in the narrative of John, because whenever Jesus will say, I and the Father are one, and the Jews will pick up stones to stone him to death for committing blasphemy. You don't have those stories in the earliest Gospels. And it's striking, and you have to explain, if Jesus did go around calling himself a divine being, if that really happened, as John says. John says it happened. And it's the major teaching of Jesus in John. If that's what happened, Why isn't it in Mark or Q? Is it that they didn't think it was important to report that part of Jesus' teachings? Or a more plausible explanation for most people, for most critical scholars, a more plausible explanation is that over time, the Christians' understanding of Jesus changed, and they started seeing him as less of just a human Messiah and more as some kind of divine being over time. And as they saw him that way, they recorded his words in those ways. And so the later sayings of John are later representations of what later Christians said about Jesus rather than what the earliest Christians. And if you think the earliest Christians thought this about Jesus, why don't they record those sayings?
Bart Ehrman's point lines up with what a lot of historians and biblical scholars have been saying for decades. The way Jesus is portrayed changes over time because early Christian beliefs were evolving. The Gospel of Mark, written around 70 AD, doesn't show Jesus calling himself divine. Instead, he talks about God's kingdom and calls people to repent. That matches what we see in the hypothetical Q source as well, an early collection of Jesus' sayings with no claims to divinity. These are the earliest layers of the tradition, but by the time we get to the Gospel of John, written 20 to 30 years later, the message has shifted. Now Jesus talks about himself, his identity, his relationship to God, and his divine authority. That change reflects a growing belief among some Christians that Jesus wasn't just the Messiah, but something more. Historians like Larry Hurtado and James Dunn have traced this shift and shown that early Christian communities gradually developed a high Christology, where Jesus was eventually worshipped like God. But that view wasn't present at the beginning. Even the Apostle Paul, writing earlier than all 4 Gospels, never quotes Jesus claiming to be God. Instead, Paul talks about Jesus being exalted after his resurrection. So when Ehrman asks why these divine claims only show up in the later Gospel, he's pointing to something backed by history, text, and serious scholarship. Belief in Jesus' divinity grew over time. It wasn't part of the earliest message. Let's hear what Peter's response to all this is.
So this developmental idea in the Gospels and the earlier Christian, later traditions around Jesus are developing the idea in the words.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great example of showing how so much scholarship, while claiming to be historically neutral, is basically very philosophically driven. Because I think even as you tease out your chronology and your development, I mean, it's really interesting how it's all stacking up towards a system in which you don't get Jesus, claiming as much early on. And I think that it's been developing for a couple hundred years within scholarship, and it's so intertwined, the historical argumentation and the sort of slight philosophical nudges here and there, that it's really, really hard to unpick. But I would just say, let's take Mark's Gospel as an example. Mark begins with this opening, I'm going to send my messenger before your face, and it's all about, quoting the Old Testament, but with John the Baptist going before the face of Jesus, when it's about in Malachi that it's from the messenger going before the face of God, and so it's presenting Jesus as in that place of God. Next chapter, he's forgiving sins. Couple of chapters later, he's stilling the storm like only God does, and it's calling on themes from Jonah. Couple of chapters later, chapter 6, he's walking on the water like only God does in Job chapter 9, and then he gets to the boat and he says, "Be of courage, I am." It's pretty dramatic. I am there in Mark 6 verse 50. It's not just that John's I am saying is slightly different, but there is precedent for them. And I'd want to say a lot of people see this as a systematic presentation of Jesus's very, very exalted status, such that people are wondering, who is this? They're asking this question, and the fact that it's doing it through a sort of more Socratic method of getting you to think who this is not, I mean, God's the only one who opens the eyes of the blind, and that's also something Jesus does, uniquely in the Gospel. So I'd want to say that all of these things come together to give you a portrait, a very exalted portrait of Jesus.
So there's a consistency, as far as you're concerned, between those earlier, if you like, accounts in Mark.
I think the whole question of development, we've got to say, when we lay out sources and we say this comes before this and this, what actually are we basing that on? How much is historically verifiable? How much of it is philosophical system? How much of it is literary system, and what's fed into that? And I think all of those things have to be laid on the table so that you can be very clear about when you're saying this is a fact, what's it actually based on?
Yeah, so I'd love to respond to that. I mean, Pete, when you start out by saying that this chronology, the development is based on a chronology that's driven by skepticism.
I didn't say driven by skepticism, but okay.
What did you say?
I think it's got an input of that.
Because I was just going on your chronology. I mean, you said earlier that you think Mark was the first gospel.
I haven't said that.
Oh, okay. You said that you thought John was the end of the first. It was the last gospel.
Yes, I have said that.
Which one do you think is first?
I don't have a view.
Okay. Would you agree John's later than the others?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That's all. That's the only development I need, and I don't see why skepticism has anything to do with it. I mean, I believe this when I was an evangelical Christian, and so, but then you want to say that it's wrong to say that Jesus isn't portrayed as divine in Mark because of all these other things.
And I know you can go through them one by one.
No. I mean, there are things you say that aren't true. I mean, it's not true that only God can heal the blind. Prophets do it all the time. Faith healers do it. So they do it with the power of God.
In the Old Testament?
Yes. So, well, and in the New Testament, I mean...
where in the Old Testament people heal the blind?
Well, in Jewish tradition, it's all over the place.
Yeah, but not in the Old Testament.
Yes. But why would you say that only God can heal the blind? I mean, I know people who say they were blind that
I'm trying to think, in the Old Testament, where are there people who heal the blind other than God?
I don't know of any.
There aren't any.
So... But I didn't say anything about that.
So I was saying, sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm saying
in the Old Testament portrayal, only God heals the blind, and then Jesus comes along and does it. That's
but so do other Jewish healers.
I think it's significant the way Jesus is portrayed. If you think about the classic...
It doesn't make somebody divine to be able to heal somebody. You have healers throughout history. They aren't God. They're empowered by God.
But I think that... the signs in the message to John the Baptist is one of the things.
Okay. So that's just a side point. I just don't think it's true. Yeah. But it doesn't really matter. You're saying that Mark portrays Jesus as divine, and that has no bearing on what I was saying. I didn't deny that. I think that Mark does see Jesus as divine. What I'm asking is, what did Jesus himself say about himself? Now. You pointed out things like John the Baptist looking to Jesus, Jesus walking in the water, Jesus healing the blind. I mean, we could talk about each of all those, but I'm agreeing that Mark portrays Jesus as divine. My question is, did Jesus go around Palestine, Galilee, and then Judea, saying, I and the Father are one? Before Abraham was, I am. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. These are sayings found in the Gospel of John, which you agree is the last of the Gospels. Those sayings are not found in Mark, which you agree is an earlier Gospel. And they're not only found not in Mark, they're not found in Luke, they're not found in Matthew, they're not from Q, they're not in any of the early sources where Jesus says these things. When you pointed out that in Mark's gospel, people continually are asking, who is this? The answer is never, he is God. And Jesus himself never says, I am God in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or their sources.
I totally agree on that. I mean, there could be all sorts of reasons not to say that. But what I want to say is there is precedent for all of the I am saying. So, for instance, Jesus, I am the bread of life. He says in the synoptics, this is my body, take this bread. He says, I am the good shepherd in John, and then he's portraying himself in stories as basically fulfilling the role of the shepherd. He says, I am the light of the world in John. In Matthew, he says, you are the light of the world to his disciples. If he's prepared to accept they're the light of the world, I don't see why he can't say that he is as well. So I think all of these things we can make connections, and I don't think, yes, the Gospels are about 9 hours long when you read them in English. So in this 2-hour section of John, there are things which aren't in the others. But don't build a massive, castle out of that. I mean, it seems to me, of course, there are going to be some things that are in one that aren't in the others.
I agree with that.
Peter says Mark shows Jesus doing things only God can do, like healing the blind or calming storms. But in Jewish tradition, prophets like Elijah and Elisha did miracles without being divine. There's no verse in the Old Testament that says only God can heal blindness. That idea developed later. He also points to Jesus saying, I am in Mark 6, but in Greek, ego eimi just means it's me. It doesn't carry the same weight as in John, where it echoes God's name in Exodus 3:14, and people try to kill Jesus for it. That doesn't happen in Mark, which shows it's not the same kind of claim. Most importantly, Ehrman asks the right question. If Jesus actually said things like, I and the Father are one, why does no early source mention it? Not Mark, Q, Matthew, Luke, or even Paul. The simplest answer is those sayings developed later, as belief in Jesus grew. We can almost get who has the stronger argument here. Let's hear what they have to say until the end.
I'm not trying to build a castle out of it because I'm just responding to Justin's question. This wouldn't be a point that I would have raised. I mean, I don't, this wouldn't be, this is not why I think the Gospels are unreliable. So this isn't, for me, this isn't even the point. But I will say that the whole idea of development is that there are things earlier that get developed later. And so the fact that you see things earlier that could lead to John's proclamations that's what the developmental view is. What you don't get is in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus saying that he's God. And my point is, if the historical Jesus really did go around saying those things, it is inconceivable to me that our earliest sources fail to mention it. Like, they didn't think that part was important. This would be the most significant thing to say, and yet none of them, not just Mark, but Matthew and their sources, by the way. I mean, I don't know what you think, but virtually every scholar I know thinks that you've got Mark, and you've got Q, and you've got M, and you've got L, and then you've got Matthew, and you've got Luke themselves. You've got 6 sources before John. None of them has these things. And so are we supposed to think, well, yeah, that was just like a minor detail they decided not to get into?
Bart makes a critical point here that Peter doesn't really address. If Jesus actually claimed to be God during his lifetime, why do none of our earliest sources record it? We're talking about 6 different sources before the Gospel of John: Mark, Q, M, L, Matthew, and Luke. And not one of them includes Jesus saying things like, I and the Father are one, or before Abraham was, I am. These aren't small statements. They would have been central if they were part of Jesus' real teachings. Yet they only appear in John, which was written nearly 60 years after Jesus' death. That's not an oversight. That's evidence of theological development. As Bart says, seeing small seeds of divinity in earlier texts doesn't mean Jesus claimed it himself. It shows how beliefs evolved after his death. Just like how later Christian communities gave him titles like Son of God or Logos, the sayings in John reflect what believers came to believe, not what Jesus historically said. Peter focuses on symbolism and hints, but Bart is asking the historical question: what did Jesus actually say about himself? And if the answer is nowhere in the earliest texts, it's reasonable to conclude he didn't claim divinity during his lifetime. We can almost get who has the stronger argument here. But what do you think? Do you believe Jesus really claimed to be God during his life, or is that something added by later believers? Let us know in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this breakdown, like the video and subscribe for more historical deep dives.
I just find it completely implausible.
But I think, John doesn't have Jesus go around saying, I am God either. So I think...
I and the Father are one. Before Abraham was, I am.
Yeah, these are big things. But, when you walk up to... okay, you may not believe it happened, but when it's portrayed as someone walking up to people on the water and then saying, I am, it's a pretty dramatic thing, isn't it?
In the Gospel of John, the man born blind is asked, were you the one who was born blind? And he replies, ego eimi.
No, sure.
I am.
Sure.
Saying I am is just a way of saying yes.
Yeah, but it's not just that when you just walked across the water. It's something different.
Peter
It's
walked
something
on the
more.
water too.
Yeah, but
Okay, did that make him God?
No, again, but there is a
But
difference.
he was the one who fell down, of course. I mean,
Exactly. He wasn't exactly within the story. But Peter doesn't go around saying,
But
I am.
I mean, what do you think Mark 6 is about when Jesus walks on the water? I mean, isn't this portraying
He's showing that God, I think Mark understands Jesus as a divine being.
The basic story, I think, is absolutely reliable in the Gospels. But I think in addition to the broad outlines of the things that Jesus did, said, and experienced, there are large numbers of inconsistencies, contradictions, non-historical accounts that make these Gospels unreliable in many, many ways. There are lots of details that are unreliable, I think, in the Gospels, but I'm not going to focus on the details because they might be interesting if you really want every single word to be right. I'm interested in the major ways for this debate that the Gospels seem to me to be unreliable, involving three big issues that I'll try to address in my time. Issues connected with Jesus' birth, Jesus' resurrection, and Jesus' teaching or preaching. Okay, so that's what I'll be talking about, those three areas. And I'm going to start with the birth. Jesus was born to the Virgin in Bethlehem. What are our sources of information for the birth of Jesus? Just in the New Testament. We don't have sources from outside the New Testament that are going to help us much for any of this material. We're restricted to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And what are our sources of information about Jesus' birth just in the New Testament? Well, we have an account of Jesus' birth in the Gospel of Matthew, chapters 1 and 2. We have an account in Luke, chapter 1 and 2. Those are the only passages in the entire New Testament that talk about Jesus' birth in Bethlehem to a virgin. That's interesting. Matthew and Luke don't talk about the birth outside of those first two chapters. They don't refer back to it. And what about other sources in the New Testament? They don't mention it. The virgin birth, of course, is a huge doctrine in the history of Christianity. In my part of the world, in the American South, Protestant evangelicals often say that if you don't believe in the virgin birth, you can't be a Christian. Why aren't there other parts of the New Testament that even talk about it? It's an interesting question that I think a lot of people haven't thought about. Why isn't there any account of Jesus' birth in our first gospel, the Gospel of Mark? Why isn't there one in the Gospel of John? Why doesn't he say anything about Jesus being born of a virgin? What about the Apostle Paul? Why doesn't he talk about the virgin birth? There are 13 letters that claim to be written by Paul. There's not a word about the virgin birth. There are 27 books in the New Testament. 25 of them don't say anything about it. That's interesting. Well, why? The bigger question I'm going to address, though, is how do we explain the differences between the two accounts that we do have? There are lots of differences between these two accounts. People don't realize this because, we hear the Christmas story every year and we sort of smash it all together in our heads. But when you actually read the accounts, it's pretty interesting. Read Matthew's account and just make a list of what happens. Then read Luke's account, make a list of what happens, and then compare your two lists. There are lots of differences. Many of them may not matter to you. Matthew has the wise men coming visit Jesus. Luke has the shepherds. Matthew has Jesus' family escaping to Egypt. Luke has the presentation at the temple and the circumcision. These are differences, but they're just different. That doesn't mean they're contradictory. There are some potential problems, though. Some potential contradictions that I think actually are real contradictions. They involve Bethlehem and Nazareth. The similarity. Matthew and Luke both agree that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but that he was raised in Nazareth. Nazareth is about 100 miles, 80 miles, 100 miles north of Bethlehem. Discrepancies in these two accounts. This one I'm not going to go into, but if you want to look for yourself, just look at the two genealogies. One in Matthew chapter 1 and the other in Luke chapter 3. And ask yourself, who actually was Jesus' grandfather? Was it Jacob or Heli? And who was his great-grandfather and his great-great-grandfather? The different genealogies all the way back to David. Is Jesus descended from David's son Solomon or David's son Nathan? Depends which one you read. Well, that's interesting. Just look for yourself and you'll see. I'm more interested in the question of why Bethlehem and why Nazareth, according to these two accounts. So here's how it works. Matthew chapters 1 and 2. In the Gospel of Matthew, Joseph and Mary start out in Bethlehem. Mary gives birth in Bethlehem, and there's a star that is leading the wise men to Jesus. The wise men are coming from the east, and they follow the star, and the star apparently stops over Jerusalem. They go into Jerusalem and ask, where's the King of the Jews to be born? And the inquiries get to the king, King Herod. Herod asks his wise men, and not his scripture scholars, to tell the wise men, and it turns out that the scriptures say that the King of the Jews is to be born in Bethlehem. And so the wise men then follow the star, reappears somehow, and it stops over the house. That's interesting. It stops over the house that Jesus is being born in. How does the star stop over a house exactly? Go out tonight and look up at the stars and tell me, which house is that star over? And it doesn't do much good if it's a comet or a supernova or anything else. I mean, so it can't be really a star. It must be something else. But that's fine. What happens, though, is they come in and worship Jesus, and they offer their 3 gifts. They're going to go home then, and they learn by an angel that they can't go back to Jerusalem to tell Herod because he's out to kill the child. And so they go some other way, and Herod sends out the troops to kill the child. They kill all the children. The troops kill all the male children in Bethlehem, the slaughter of the innocents. That, by the way, is a very interesting story. There's no record of that. There's no record of that happening in any ancient document other than this. You would think that would be in the newspaper. Joseph and Mary learn that the Herod's after the child, and so they escape to Egypt. They get out of there to escape Herod, and they go to Egypt. And of course, if you're going to Egypt from Bethlehem, you got to walk. I mean, you can't take a train, and so it takes a while to get there. And they're in Egypt until Herod dies. And when Herod dies, they start to return, but they realize they can't go back to Judea, where Bethlehem is, in the south of what we think of as Israel. And so they relocate to Nazareth. And that's why Jesus is born in Bethlehem and raised in Nazareth, in Matthew. Luke has a very different account. In Luke, Joseph and Mary start in Nazareth. That's where they're from, and it turns out there's a worldwide census. The Roman Emperor Caesar Augustus has decided that the entire world has to register for a census, and so everybody has to go to their ancestral home. Joseph has to go to Bethlehem to register for the census because he's from the lineage of King David. And King David came from Bethlehem. Now, this is a very weird phenomenon just on the surface of it. How is it that everybody... Joseph was 1,000 years after David. Everybody's going to where their ancestors were 1,000 years earlier to register for a census? According to Luke, it's the census of the entire world. Well, that can't be right. It must be the Roman Empire. Okay, the entire Roman Empire. Everybody's going to their ancestral home from 1,000 years earlier? How does that work? I mean, suppose the Democrats just really take over everything next time, and they decide, we all need to register for a tax, because you know how much they like to tax people, and so, they got to go register and you've got to go to register for this tax. You've got to go to where your ancestors came from 1,000 years ago. Where are you going to go? Really? And the entire population's doing this, and it doesn't get reported in the newspaper? There is no record of this anywhere, except for Luke. Well, Mary gives birth in Bethlehem, and 8 days later, Jesus is circumcised, and then 32 days after that, they go to the temple to present a sacrifice as commanded in the book of Leviticus, chapter 12. So it's 40 days later, and then after that, 40 days after birth, Mary gives her offering, and then they return home to Nazareth. Wait a second. In Matthew, they flee to Egypt. How do they go home 40 days later in Luke if they're on their way to Egypt? And they stay in Egypt until Herod dies. And then they can't come back to Judea because the next ruler is worse than Herod. And so this is months and months, years, I don't know, but Luke says they went back 40 days later. How can that possibly be right? They can't both be right. The deal is that either one of them is right and the other is wrong and therefore unreliable, or they're both wrong and therefore both unreliable. They both can't be right.
Historians widely agree that the birth stories in Matthew and Luke aren't reliable history. And here's why. First, no Roman census ever required people to return to their ancient ancestral hometowns, let alone a town from 1,000 years earlier like Bethlehem. Roman records show censuses were taken for taxation and military control, and people registered where they lived. It would have been a logistical nightmare to do what Luke describes, and there's zero evidence it ever happened. Second, the massacre of infants in Bethlehem, described only in Matthew, isn't recorded by Josephus, the most detailed first-century historian who chronicled Herod's reign. Josephus documented Herod's many crimes, including killing his own sons, but never mentioned mass infanticide, which would have stood out. Finally, the genealogies in Matthew and Luke are different, not just in names, but in how Jesus is linked to David, one through Solomon, the other through Nathan. These contradictions make it impossible to claim both are historically accurate. So Ehrman's point is backed by solid evidence and mainstream biblical scholarship. Let's hear more. Let's watch again.
How do the disciples of Jesus learn that he's been raised from the dead? In each gospel. Simply read them yourselves, you'll see. In the Gospel of Mark, we're explicitly told that the women go to the tomb, they learn that he's been raised from the dead. They are told to go tell his disciples that he's been raised and he will meet them in Galilee. And the women fled from the tomb, and they didn't say anything to anyone because they were afraid. Period. The gospel stops there. They didn't tell anyone. That's the end of the Gospel of Mark. In Matthew, I should have put Matthew here, Matthew, Luke, and John, the women go to the tomb, they hear that Jesus has been raised, they're supposed to go tell the disciples, and they go right away and they tell. Well, which is it? Where do the disciples go if they go anywhere? Mark and Matthew, Mark presupposes that they're supposed to go to Galilee. Matthew says they go to Galilee, and that's where they meet Jesus. But in Luke, the women hear about Jesus being raised, and then Jesus appears to two followers the same day, we're told. The women go tell the disciples, and while they're talking to the disciples, Jesus shows up on the same day, and then he takes them out, and he tells them, don't leave Jerusalem. In the south. Don't leave Jerusalem. Stay in Jerusalem until you receive the Spirit. When you get to the next book written by the same author, Acts, they're in Jerusalem 40 days later. And they stay in Jerusalem after that. Jesus appears to them in Jerusalem and tells them not to leave, and they don't leave for months. In Matthew, they go straight to Galilee. How could it be both? It can't be both. Where do they see Jesus? Do they see Jesus anywhere? Not in Mark. In Mark, the women don't even tell anybody. In Matthew, they see Jesus only in Galilee. They make a trip up to Galilee, they go up to Galilee, they're in Galilee. They see Jesus, and then he leaves them. In Luke, however, they see him only in Jerusalem, and Jesus tells them, don't leave Jerusalem, and they stay in Jerusalem. They see Jesus, and then he ascends to heaven. Well, how can they... Just read them yourself. They differ from each other in a way that can't be reconciled. How can all of these accounts be right?
The resurrection stories in the Gospels contradict each other in ways that historians take seriously. For example, the earliest Gospel, Mark, ends with the women fleeing the tomb in fear and telling no one. That's in the oldest manuscripts. The later verses people often read were added much later, centuries after. Now compare that to Luke. Luke says Jesus appears that very day in Jerusalem and tells the disciples to stay put. That directly conflicts with Matthew, where Jesus appears in Galilee, 70 miles north, and gives the Great Commission. Even more, Acts, written by the same author as Luke, says Jesus stayed for 40 days after the resurrection, yet that's not mentioned in Matthew or Mark. It looks like later writers reshaped the story over time to fit different theological points. This isn't a small detail. When key moments like where and when Jesus appeared vary this much, historians can't treat the resurrection stories as consistent eyewitness accounts. Let's hear what Jimmy has to say about whether the Gospels are historically reliable.
And I would propose, in light of that, that a source may be judged historically reliable if we can verify many of its major claims, many of its intermediate claims, and many of its lesser claims. So if we can check it out and show, wow, a bunch of its major claims and intermediate claims and lesser claims, they're accurate, then we can judge it to be historically reliable. Until we've seen enough errors to counterbalance this. So if you see a picture like this, with lots of verified claims on the major, intermediate, and minor levels, then you can judge that document historically reliable. Now, of course, you need to understand how to read the document. Like if it's an ancient document, you need to know how ancient sources worked so you can interpret it correctly. And I'll have more to say about that in my second statement. But for the moment, let's look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and see what we can determine about their reliability. Well, here's a list of major claims that the Gospels make. Jesus existed. Jesus was a Jew. He lived in the 1st century in Roman Palestine. He had a reputation as a teacher on both moral and prophetic subjects. He gathered disciples, including an inner circle of 12 disciples. He was crucified, and the man who put him to death, the man who ordered him crucified, was the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. So, how can we evaluate these claims? Well, I'd love to be able to present you with all the evidence I'm aware of, but I've got 11 minutes left in this opening statement. So, I'm going to have to do something else. And fortunately, we have with us tonight Bart Ehrman. See, he's right up there. And he's also right here, incarnate, as it were. So, what does Bart Ehrman make of these major gospel claims? Well, one thing, as a historian, he's not going to say that a historical document ever gives you absolute certainty about what happened in the past, but it will give you probabilities. And so even though he wouldn't say that we have ontological certitude that certain things happened about Jesus, he will say the Gospels are probably right about some things. In fact, he already said it in his opening statement. And sometimes he'll say they're very, very probably right. So what about that first major gospel claim, that Jesus existed? Well, Bart Ehrman says that's right. In fact, he wrote a book called Did Jesus Exist?, in which he combats mythicists, Jesus mythicists who say Jesus didn't really exist, he was just a myth. Bart wrote an entire book refuting that point of view, and I think he deserves credit. Let's give Bart a big hand of applause. Thank you. And this is something that Bart and I agree about. Jesus really existed. High five. Yeah! So, Bart agrees that Jesus existed. What does he think about these other major claims? Well, without making too long of a point of it, he thinks that the Gospels are right when they say Jesus was a Jew who lived in the 1st century in Palestine, who was a teacher on moral subjects, on prophetic subjects, who gathered disciples, who had an inner circle of 12 disciples, who was crucified, and who was sent to his crucifixion by Pontius Pilate. So Bart agrees on all these major gospel claims. Well, what about intermediate claims, things of a slightly lesser scale in the Gospels? Well, the Gospels say that Jesus lived in the first century, but more specifically, they indicate he was an adult in the AD 20s. Bart Ehrman says that's right. The Gospels indicate Jesus lived in Roman Palestine, but more specifically, they say he came from Nazareth. Bart says that's right. The Gospels say Jesus was connected with John the Baptist. Bart agrees. Jesus was baptized at the beginning of his ministry, according to the Gospels. Bart agrees. John the Baptist was the one who did the baptism, and Bart agrees. What about John the Baptist himself? Well, the Gospels indicate that John preached a message of coming destruction and salvation. Bart says that's right. The Gospels also indicate that Jesus agreed with John the Baptist's message. Bart says that's right too. Jesus not only was a teacher, but one of the ways he taught was in parables, according to the Gospels. Bart says that's right. One of Jesus' major themes in his teaching was the kingdom of God, and Bart said that, in fact, in his opening statement. Jesus believed that he was the king of that coming kingdom, or the Messiah. And Bart says Jesus did believe that. Jesus taught that there was a coming reversal of fortunes where the exalted would be humbled and the humble would be exalted, according to the Gospels and according to Bart Ehrman. Jesus didn't think that you needed to scrupulously observe the Mosaic Law in the way that some thought you did. Bart agrees. Also, Jesus believed that the heart of the Mosaic Law was the love of God and the love of neighbor. Bart signs off on that too. And Jesus believed that the way to attain the kingdom was through love of God and neighbor. Once again, the Gospels and Bart agree. Because Jesus' teachings were different than other Jewish teachers, Jesus was in conflict with them. He also spent much of his preaching ministry in Galilee. But at the end of the ministry, he went to Jerusalem for Passover, and he predicted the destruction of the temple, and he was betrayed to the Jewish authorities. He had a follower named Judas. Judas was the man who betrayed him to the Jewish authorities. The Jewish authorities then handed him over to Pilate, and Pilate had him crucified for calling himself the King of the Jews. On all of these points, the Gospels are probably right, according to Bart Ehrman. So Bart not only agrees that the major claims we covered are accurate, but all of these intermediate ones as well.
Yes, many of the Gospel's big-picture claims are likely true. Jesus existed, he was Jewish, he taught, he was crucified. Bart Ehrman agrees, and so does nearly every serious historian. But here's the catch. Acknowledging those broad facts doesn't make the Gospels historically reliable overall. A document can include true claims and still contain major historical problems. That's the case here. When core events like Jesus' birth and resurrection are told in contradictory ways, it raises red flags. And when key theological ideas like the virgin birth or post-resurrection appearances are completely absent from most of the New Testament, it suggests these ideas developed over time, rather than being uniformly known or witnessed. The Gospels aren't neutral biographies. They're written decades later, shaped by theology, not just memory. So while they preserve some real history, the inconsistencies matter, especially when evaluating reliability as a whole. What do you think? Can a document be historically reliable if its most important claims don't line up? If you're enjoying this breakdown, make sure to like, subscribe, and click the bell so you don't miss what's next.